Michael Carter slid the divorce papers across the polished table inside the private banking lounge, his voice low but sharp enough for others to hear. Crystal Hughes didn't reach for them. Her twins slept quietly beside her, unaware of the decision being made over their future. He spoke of accounts already emptied, of a life already reassigned, as if her silence confirmed his victory. A few employees glanced over, then quickly away. Michael believed the money was gone. He believed control had already changed hands. What he didn't know was that the bank he trusted to erase her future had never been outside her reach. If you believe silence can be strength, stay with this story until the end. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories of truth, justice, and quiet resilience matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. The marriage between Crystal Hughes and Michael Carter had not collapsed overnight. It had eroded slowly, quietly, in ways that left no obvious fracture at first glance. To anyone outside their glass-walled apartment overlooking the Hudson, they still looked composed, successful, intact. The kind of couple people assumed had already solved life. Inside, the silence had a different weight. Crystal moved through her days with a rhythm that had nothing to do with Michael anymore. The twins, barely a few months old, defined her hours. Feeding schedules, soft cries in the early morning, the quiet adjustments of blankets, the steady presence of her hands. She rarely rushed. Even exhaustion had a structure in her world. She documented everything without appearing to. Not just the baby's routines, but the small inconsistencies that had begun to collect around her husband. Michael, on the other hand, had become increasingly efficient in a different way. He no longer lingered in conversations. His answers were shorter, cleaner, often delivered without eye contact. He moved through the apartment like someone managing a schedule rather than sharing a life. His phone was always within reach, always angled slightly away. Notifications came in less frequently, or perhaps they had simply been silenced. Either way, the absence of sound had begun to say more than any message. Crystal noticed that first. Not the content of what he was doing, but the absence of what used to be visible. Banking alerts that once appeared regularly were gone. Routine confirmations, small automatic messages that had once passed unnoticed, no longer surfaced. The account still existed. The structure remained. But something had shifted beneath it. She did not ask him about it. Instead, she began to pay attention to patterns. Michael's departures became more precise. Not earlier, not later, but exact. He left at times that aligned too cleanly with something unseen. His returns carried a different energy, not tired, not relieved, but contained, as if he had completed something each time and was now protecting the result. Crystal adjusted her own routine without announcing it. While the twins slept, she sat near the window with a notebook that looked like it belonged to her children's care schedule. Feeding times, sleep cycles, pediatric notes. Between those lines, she added timestamps, small entries that meant nothing to anyone else. The time Michael picked up his phone and stepped onto the balcony, the exact minute he left without explanation, the length of calls that ended when she entered the room. She did not interpret. She recorded. There had been a time earlier in their marriage when she might have asked questions, not confrontational ones, clarifying ones. Back then, Michael had still responded with something resembling partnership. That version of him had disappeared, gradually replaced by someone who answered questions with conclusions rather than explanations. Now she chose not to ask. The shift in their dynamic had become most visible after the twins were born. Michael had visited the hospital, of course. He had stood beside her bed, had held one of the babies for a brief moment, had smiled in a way that photographs would capture as warmth. But even then, something had been slightly misaligned. His attention had not settled. It had moved subtly but consistently toward his phone, toward something waiting outside the room. Crystal had seen that too. not as a betrayal in that moment, but as a deviation, a signal that his center of gravity had moved elsewhere. Back at home, the distance widened. He began referring to the twins in logistical terms: their schedule, their needs, the adjustments required. Never unkind, but never fully present. Crystal absorbed that language without reacting. She did not correct him. She did not demand a different tone. She simply continued. Her calm unsettled him more than resistance would have. There were moments when Michael watched her from across the room, as if trying to determine whether she understood something he had not yet said. She would meet his gaze briefly, then return to whatever she was doing. Feeding one of the twins, adjusting a blanket, writing something down. He mistook that for detachment. In reality, it was discipline. The financial changes accelerated in subtle increments. A joint account that had once covered household expenses began to show delays in replenishment. Transfers that used to appear automatically required manual confirmation. Crystal noticed the timing first, not the amount. The delay between when funds should have arrived and when they actually did. She logged it. Michael compensated by increasing visible spending in other areas. New commitments. Quiet purchases that were meant to signal stability. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing seemed wrong. If anything, his financial behavior suggested confidence. Crystal understood that confidence differently. It was not based on abundance. It was based on certainty. He believed he knew something she did not. One evening, as the light faded across the city and the twins finally slept in unison, Michael stood near the kitchen counter reviewing something on his phone. The screen reflected briefly in the glass surface behind him. Crystal did not move closer. She did not try to see. But she observed the angle, the tension in his shoulders, the stillness of his hands. He was not browsing. He was confirming. When he finished, he exhaled in a way that was almost imperceptible. A release that came from completion, not relief. He set the phone down for a moment, then picked it up again, as if ensuring it remained within reach. Crystal wrote down the time. 10:42 p.m. No interpretation, just a marker. The next morning, he left earlier than usual. Not rushed, not anxious, just precise. Crystal watched from the window as he walked toward the waiting car below. His posture was straight, controlled, unchanged. He did not look back. She returned to the table, opened her notebook, and added another line. Departure 7:15 a.m. No explanation needed. What Michael did not realize was that his pattern had become more visible than his actions. Each adjustment he made to conceal movement created a new point of reference. Each effort to reduce trace left behind a different kind of signal. Crystal was not chasing information. She was allowing it to reveal itself. By the end of the week, her notebook contained a quiet structure of its own. Times, durations, absences. Not conclusions, not accusations. Just a framework that suggested alignment. Something was happening at specific intervals, something that required consistency, something financial. She closed the notebook and placed it beside the twins' schedule. From the outside, nothing had changed. The apartment remained calm. The children were cared for. The routines held. But beneath that surface, two entirely different understandings of the same life were unfolding. Michael believed he was moving unseen, securing his future step by step, shifting assets beyond reach before any confrontation could occur. In his mind, the outcome was already decided. The divorce would simply formalize what he had already executed. Crystal understood something else, not yet the full scope, not yet the complete structure, but enough to recognize direction. Enough to know that silence in this moment was not absence. It was preparation. And unlike Michael, she was not working toward an assumption. She was working toward proof. Michael Carter did not move money all at once. He understood just enough about scrutiny to avoid it. Large, abrupt transfers attracted attention. Patterns, however, could be disguised if they were broken into smaller movements, routed through entities that appeared ordinary and timed to align with legitimate financial activity. He had learned that much from years in corporate environments where appearance often mattered more than substance. What he did not fully understand was that patterns did not disappear when divided. They multiplied. The bank he chose, Sterling Crest Bank, was one he trusted for its reputation. Discreet, well-structured, and known among a certain circle for handling complex accounts without unnecessary interference. It was the kind of institution where clients believed their intentions would remain unexamined, provided the transactions followed acceptable form. Michael took comfort in that. His first transfer had been conservative. A modest amount moved from a joint account into a newly formed limited liability company Carter Holdings LLC, registered only weeks earlier. The paperwork was clean, the purpose vaguely defined but plausible. It did not raise any immediate concerns. He waited. When no resistance appeared, he continued. Over the next several days, additional transfers followed. None of them large enough to trigger automatic escalation. Each one separated by just enough time to appear unrelated. Each one routed through accounts that made the trail longer, more complex, more difficult to follow without intent. Michael believed he was creating distance. In reality, he was creating a map. Crystal did not see the transactions directly, not at first. What she noticed instead was absence. The shared financial ecosystem of their household had always been predictable. Alerts for deposits, confirmations for outgoing payments, routine notifications that formed the background noise of their lives. They had been so consistent that their presence had become invisible. Now that invisibility had shifted, there were fewer notifications. Not none, just fewer. Crystal recognized the difference immediately. Not because she tracked every dollar, but because she understood rhythm. The rhythm of systems, of routines, of things that operated without needing attention until they changed. She sat at the dining table one afternoon, while the twins slept, her phone resting in front of her. The screen remained quiet. It wasn't silence that concerned her. It was the timing of it. She opened the banking application, not to search for discrepancies, but to confirm alignment. The balances appeared stable. The numbers had not yet shifted in a way that would raise alarm. But the pathways had changed. Certain transactions that should have appeared as pending were not there. Expected internal movements had either been delayed or rerouted. The surface looked intact. The structure beneath it did not. Crystal closed the app. She did not attempt to trace it digitally. Not yet. Instead, she returned to her notebook. The entries had grown more precise. She now recorded not only Michael's movements, but also the intervals between them. The time between his phone calls and his departures. The duration of his absences. The days when notifications disappeared entirely, followed by days when they resumed in partial form. Patterns began to emerge. 3 days of reduced activity. 1 day of visible normalcy. Then another sequence of quiet shifts. She did not label them. She simply marked them. Michael, meanwhile, had grown more confident with each successful transfer. The absence of immediate consequence reinforced his belief that the system was working in his favor. He began to increase the frequency of transactions, compressing timelines that had once been spaced apart. Confidence for him translated into acceleration. One evening, he stood alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching beneath him in steady lines. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low but firm. "Yes," he said. "That's the last of it for now. Keep it moving through the same channels. No delays." A pause. "No, she won't notice. She doesn't look at this level. Crystal stood just inside the sliding door, her reflection faint in the glass. She could not hear every word. The city noise softened the edges of his voice. But she did not need full sentences. Fragments were enough. She stepped away before he turned. In her notebook, she added, "Call duration 6 minutes, 18 seconds. Tone-controlled directive. Assumption underestimates observation. No conclusions, only observations." The next morning, Michael met with Kevin Adler, a mid-level banker at Sterling Crest. Kevin was efficient, responsive, and careful, at least on the surface. He understood the expectations of clients like Michael. Speed mattered. Discretion mattered more. Michael handed him a set of instructions. "Same structure," he said. "Break it up. Move it through the LLC, then into the secondary accounts. Keep everything within standard thresholds." Kevin nodded, though a slight hesitation lingered. "These are starting to cluster," Kevin replied carefully. "Not enough to trigger anything formal, but—" "They won't," Michael interrupted. "You said yourself, as long as we stay within limits." Kevin adjusted his posture. "Yes, within limits." Michael leaned forward slightly. "Then we stay within limits." The conversation ended there. What neither of them acknowledged was that limits were not only numerical, they were behavioral. And behavior once repeated became visible. Back at the apartment, Crystal adjusted the twins' blankets as the afternoon light softened across the room. One of them stirred briefly, then settled again. The quiet returned. She sat down and opened her notebook. The structure was now undeniable. The days Michael made calls aligned with the days notifications disappeared. The timing of his departures matched the intervals between missing financial activity. The pattern repeated with minor variations, but the core remained intact. She turned to a fresh page. For the first time, she drew lines. Not conclusions, but connections. A vertical column of timestamps, a parallel column of observed absences. Between them, thin lines indicating alignment. It was not proof, but it was direction. She closed the notebook slowly. Across the room, her phone remained silent. Crystal picked it up not to check the accounts again, but to scroll through her contacts. Her finger paused briefly over a name she had not needed to use in years. Jonathan Reeves. She did not call, not yet. Instead, she locked the screen and set the phone back down. The decision was not about urgency. It was about timing. Michael believed he was ahead because he had already acted. Because the transfers had already begun. Because the structure he built existed in motion, not in theory. Crystal understood something different. Movement without awareness created exposure. And exposure, once documented, became evidence. That night, as Michael returned home later than usual, his demeanor carried a subtle shift. Not tension, not anxiety, something closer to satisfaction. The kind that came from believing a process was nearing completion. He placed his keys on the counter, glanced briefly toward the living room, where Crystal sat with one of the twins, and offered a faint, almost rehearsed smile. "Long day," he said. Crystal looked up, her expression steady. "I imagine," she replied. Nothing in her tone suggested accusation. Nothing in her posture suggested suspicion. To Michael, it confirmed what he already believed, that she was unaware. He moved past her without hesitation. Crystal watched him go, then lowered her gaze to the child in her arms. The baby shifted slightly, settling into a deeper sleep. She reached for her notebook one more time. Final entry for the day, pattern consistent. Acceleration increasing. Observation sufficient. She closed the cover and set it aside. The next step would not be written down. It would be initiated. But not yet. Because for Crystal Hughes, timing was not about reacting to what had already happened. It was about ensuring that when the truth surfaced, it would not need explanation, only recognition. Crystal Hughes did not act the moment she understood the pattern. Understanding to her was not a trigger. It was a threshold. She waited until the structure beneath Michael's movements became stable enough to withstand scrutiny, until repetition had turned into consistency, and consistency into something that could be demonstrated without interpretation. Only then did she reach for the next step. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind that carried no urgency from the outside. The twins had just fallen asleep, their breathing steady and synchronized in a way that always calmed her. The apartment was still. Even the city beyond the glass seemed muted. Crystal picked up her phone and opened her contacts again. Jonathan Reeves. She pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Crystal. His voice was measured, neither surprised nor overly familiar. It carried the tone of someone who understood that calls like this did not come without reason. I need to preserve records, she said. There was no preamble, no explanation. A brief pause followed. Understood, Jonathan replied. What kind of records? Financial movement. Multiple transactions over the past 2 weeks, routed through Sterling Crest. Another pause, shorter this time. Do you want intervention? No, Crystal said. Not yet. Jonathan did not ask why. He had known her since before she understood the full weight of what she had inherited. He knew the difference between reaction and intention, and he recognized immediately which one she was choosing. Then we proceed quietly, he said. I'll initiate preservation through compliance channels. Limited scope, no disruption. Thank you. She ended the call without further discussion. The process had begun. At Sterling Crest Bank, the request arrived not as an alarm, but as a formality. A legal preservation notice, narrowly defined, routed through internal governance protocols. It did not accuse. It did not demand action. It simply required that certain categories of data be retained in their original state, without alteration or deletion. For most employees, it was routine. For Daniel Brooks, it was not. Daniel had spent over 25 years in compliance. He understood the difference between routine preservation and intentional observation. The language of the request was precise, but its timing suggested something more. He reviewed the parameters: accounts linked to recent transfers, internal communication logs associated with those transactions, access records, authorization chains. Nothing overtly alarming, but enough to warrant attention. He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering. Who initiated this, he asked. An assistant glanced at the system. Request came through legal. Jonathan Reeves. Daniel nodded once. That name carried weight. Not because it was loud, but because it was careful. Jonathan Reeves did not move without reason, and he did not involve compliance without understanding the implications. Daniel turned back to the screen. Pull the logs, he said. Full scope within the request. No expansions yet. Yes, sir. The system responded with quiet efficiency. Data began to assemble. Crystal did not follow the process in real time. She did not request updates. She did not ask for summaries. She trusted that the mechanism, once engaged, would function as intended. Instead, she continued her routine. The twins needed feeding. Their schedule did not adjust for legal procedures or financial irregularities. Crystal moved through the day with the same steadiness she had maintained before the call. From the outside, nothing had changed. Michael returned home that evening with the same controlled energy he had carried for weeks. He placed his phone on the counter, removed his jacket, and moved through the apartment with practiced ease. How was your day? He asked, almost automatically. Quiet, Crystal replied. He nodded, satisfied with the simplicity of the answer. In his mind, quiet meant stable. It meant nothing had shifted. He did not notice the difference between silence and stillness. At the bank, The first layer of data revealed itself without resistance. Transaction logs aligned with the preservation request. Dates times amounts. Each movement recorded precisely as it had occurred. Daniel reviewed them carefully. Nothing individually significant. But when viewed collectively, a pattern emerged. Multiple transfers, each below standard reporting thresholds. Routed through a newly established entity. Timed in intervals that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. He did not draw conclusions. He expanded the view. Pull internal alerts, he instructed. A few seconds passed. 2 flags, the assistant said. Both cleared at initial review. Daniel's expression did not change. Reasons. Structuring indicators. But amounts were within acceptable limits. No escalation required at the time. Daniel nodded slowly. Structuring. The word itself did not indicate wrongdoing. It described a method. A way of organizing transactions to fit within predefined parameters. But when repeated, it suggested intent. He leaned forward slightly. Who handled the accounts? The assistant checked. Kevin Adler. Daniel made a note. Add his communication logs to the preservation set. Yes, sir. Still no escalation, just expansion. Crystal sat by the window that evening, the twins asleep beside her, the city lights reflecting faintly across the glass. Her notebook remained closed. She no longer needed to add entries. The pattern had reached its natural conclusion. Now it existed elsewhere. In systems designed to remember without bias. In records that did not rely on interpretation. In processes that would continue whether she observed them or not. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table. There was no tension in her posture. Only presence. Michael, unaware of any shift beyond his own progress, had begun to think in terms of completion. The transfers were nearly done. The structure he had built was holding. The absence of resistance confirmed his assumptions. He allowed himself a degree of confidence that had not been present before. Plans began to take shape. Conversations with Lauren became more specific. Discussions about space, about timing, about what would happen once the divorce was finalized. He spoke as if the outcome were already secured. Lauren listened with interest, her questions becoming more detailed with each conversation. And she has no access? She asked one night, her tone casual but focused. Michael shook his head. None that matters. It was a simple answer, delivered with certainty, built on incomplete understanding. Back at Sterling Crest, Daniel reviewed the communication logs associated with Kevin Adler. The emails were concise, professional, within acceptable tone. But tone was not the only indicator. Timing mattered. He aligned the emails with the transaction logs. Requests sent shortly before transfers. Confirmations immediately after. Occasional urgency and phrasing, subtle but present. Nothing explicit. But enough. Daniel leaned back again, his expression thoughtful. Flag for internal review, he said. The assistant hesitated slightly. Formal review, preliminary. Daniel clarified. No notifications, just observation. The system updated quietly. A new layer had been added. Crystal did not receive a notification. She did not expect one. Her role in the process was not to monitor its progress, but to ensure its integrity. She stood and moved toward the twins, adjusting a blanket that had shifted slightly. One of them stirred, then settled again. The room returned to stillness. She looked down at them for a moment longer than necessary. Not because she was uncertain, but because everything she was doing, every step she had taken, extended beyond the present moment. It was not about Michael, not entirely. It was about what remained after him. The next morning, as sunlight filtered softly into the apartment, Michael prepared to leave again. His movements were efficient, unchanged. He checked his phone, glanced briefly at Crystal, and offered a short nod. "I'll be late," he said. Crystal met his gaze. I understand. He left without hesitation. The door closed with a quiet finality. Crystal stood where she was for a moment, then turned back toward the table. Her notebook remained in place, untouched. She did not open it. There was nothing left to record. Because what mattered now was no longer happening in fragments. It was assembling. And when it finished, it would not require her voice to be understood. Only the truth preserved exactly as it had occurred. Michael Carter chose the setting carefully. He did not want a private conversation. Privacy suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty was not a position he intended to occupy. What he wanted was clarity, not just for Crystal, but for anyone who might later hear about what happened. He wanted the narrative to begin in a place that implied authority. So he chose the private banking lounge at Sterling Crest. It was not loud, not crowded, but visible enough. A place where discretion and observation coexisted. Where conversations were not meant to be overheard, but often were. Where appearances carried weight. Crystal arrived on time. The twins were with her, secured in a double stroller, their presence quiet but undeniable. She addressed simply in neutral tones that neither drew attention nor deflected it. Her expression, as always, remained composed. Michael was already there. He stood near one of the polished tables, speaking briefly with a staff member, before turning as she approached. His posture was straight, his movements controlled. There was no hesitation in his expression. "Crystal," he said. She nodded once. They sat across from each other. The table between them reflected the soft overhead lighting, creating a surface that felt almost too clean for what was about to take place. A few employees moved in the background, not close enough to intrude, but not far enough to be unaware. Michael placed a folder on the table. He did not slide it toward her immediately. "I wanted to handle this efficiently," he began, "without unnecessary complication." Crystal did not respond. He opened the folder and turned it toward her. Inside were the divorce papers, prepared, structured, complete. "I've already arranged the financial side," he continued. "There's nothing left that requires negotiation." His tone was measured, almost professional, as if he were concluding a business transaction. Crystal looked down at the documents, her eyes moving slowly across the first page. She did not reach for a pen. She did not interrupt. Michael interpreted that as compliance. "I've ensured there's provision for you and the children," he said. "Within reason, within reason." The phrase settled between them without emphasis. Crystal turned a page. Her movements were unhurried. Around them, the room maintained its quiet rhythm. Conversations continued in low tones. A staff member paused briefly near the entrance, then moved on. Nothing dramatic, just observation. Michael leaned back slightly. "This doesn't need to be difficult," he added. "It's already been resolved." Crystal lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. "What has she asked?" The question was simple. Not confrontational, not emotional, just precise. Michael held her gaze. "The structure," he replied. "The accounts. The outcome." He gestured lightly toward the papers. "This is just the formal part." Crystal lowered her gaze again. She turned another page. The twins shifted softly in the stroller beside her, one of them letting out a faint sound before settling again. Crystal adjusted the blanket without looking away from the document. Michael watched her, a slight tension forming in the space between expectation and reality. He had anticipated resistance, or at least reaction. Her stillness disrupted that expectation. "You don't need to go through every detail," he said. "It's standard." Crystal's finger paused briefly at a paragraph. Standard for whom, she asked. Michael exhaled quietly. "For situations like this." He did not elaborate. Crystal continued reading. Each clause, each condition, each assumption embedded within the language. Primary custody framed as logistical necessity. Financial provision defined by his interpretation of adequacy. Asset division presented as already determined, not negotiated, declared. Across the room, a woman entered the lounge, her presence drawing a subtle shift in attention. Lauren Price. She moved with confidence. Her expression composed, her attire precise. She did not approach immediately. Instead, she positioned herself within view, close enough to observe, far enough to maintain plausible distance. Michael noticed. A brief glance. A nearly imperceptible acknowledgement. Crystal did not look up, but she registered the change in the air. Another line added to a structure already complete. Lauren's presence was not incidental. It was part of the narrative Michael was constructing. Visibility, confirmation, control. Crystal reached the final page of the document. She closed the folder gently. For a moment, she said nothing. Michael waited. "This is incomplete," she said. The words were calm, delivered without emphasis. Michael's expression tightened slightly. In what way? Crystal rested her hands lightly on the folder. "It assumes a conclusion that hasn't been established." Michael leaned forward. "It has," he said. "You just haven't acknowledged it yet." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. Crystal met his gaze again. "And the accounts?" she asked. A flicker of impatience crossed his expression. "They've been handled." "How?" The question landed with quiet precision. Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second. Appropriately, he replied. Crystal held his gaze a moment longer. Then she looked back down at the folder. Around them, the room remained steady, but attention had shifted. A staff member paused at a nearby desk, their focus briefly diverted. Another adjusted papers that did not require adjustment. Not intrusion, just awareness. Crystal opened the folder again. This time she did not read. She simply observed the structure, the assumptions embedded within it, the finality Michael had assigned to something that in reality had not yet been tested. She closed it once more. "I won't sign this today," she said. Michael's expression hardened slightly. "There's no reason to delay." "There is," Crystal replied. She did not elaborate. Michael's jaw tightened. "This isn't a negotiation, Crystal." "No," she said. "It isn't." The agreement in her tone created a brief, unexpected silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lauren shifted slightly in the background, her attention sharpening. Michael reached for the folder, sliding it back toward himself. "Fine," he said. "Take time if you need it. It doesn't change anything." Crystal stood. Her movements were steady, unhurried. She adjusted the stroller, ensuring the twins remained undisturbed. Michael remained seated, watching her. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. Crystal looked at him one last time. "Only if it was simple to begin with," she replied. There was no accusation in her voice. No raised tone, just a statement. She turned and began to walk toward the exit. As she passed through the lounge, the subtle awareness of those around her followed for a moment, then receded. Conversations resumed. Movements continued. From the outside, nothing had changed. Michael remained at the table, the folder resting in front of him. Lauren approached slowly, taking the seat Crystal had just vacated. "Well," she asked. Michael leaned back, his expression controlled. "She'll sign," he said. "She just needs time to accept it." Lauren studied him for a moment. "And the money?" Michael's gaze shifted briefly toward the glass wall where the city stretched beyond. "It's already done." His voice carried the same certainty, unquestioned, untested. Lauren nodded, satisfied. Across the room, a staff member glanced discreetly in their direction, then returned to their work. unseen by Michael, unnoticed by Lauren, but part of the same environment that had witnessed everything. Outside, Crystal moved through the city with quiet precision. The twins remained asleep. The world continued as it always did. But something had shifted. Not in appearance, not yet, but in direction. Because what Michael had presented as an ending had not been recognized as one. And what Crystal had declined was not the document itself. It was the assumption behind it. The assumption that control could be declared without being proven. As she reached the car waiting at the curb, Crystal paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle. For a moment, she allowed herself to consider the sequence ahead. Not emotionally, not reactively, but structurally. The records were preserved. The pattern was established. The next step would not be visible, not immediately. She opened the door and placed the stroller inside, securing it with practiced care. Then, she stepped in beside it. The door closed softly. And with it, the distance between what Michael believed and what was actually unfolding became just a little wider. Crystal did not return to the bank the following day. She did not call Michael. She did not revisit the conversation in her mind. There was no visible reaction to what had taken place in the lounge, no emotional residue that altered her routine. To anyone observing from the outside, her life continued with the same quiet structure it had held for weeks. But the difference now was not in what she did. It was in what had already been set in motion. Jonathan Reeves did not move quickly. He moved correctly. Within 24 hours of Crystal's call, formal preservation had transitioned into controlled examination. The scope remained narrow on paper, but internally the direction had shifted. What began as a request to retain data was now being treated as a potential integrity review. Daniel Brooks understood that transition without needing it explained. He had seen it before, not often, but enough to recognize the moment when routine compliance crossed into something more consequential. "Begin correlation," he instructed. The assistant nodded. Transaction logs, communication records, access points, each data set that had been preserved was now aligned against the others. Not expanded beyond authorization, but layered within it. Time became the anchor. When transactions occurred, when requests were made, when confirmations were sent, when systems registered internal flags that had previously been cleared without escalation, patterns began to solidify. Kevin Adler noticed the shift before anyone spoke to him. Not through direct confrontation, but through absence. Requests he had submitted days earlier were now pending longer than expected. Internal systems that normally responded within minutes required additional verification. Access confirmations appeared slower, as if routed through an unseen filter. He sat at his desk, reviewing a transaction screen that had not updated. A subtle unease settled in. He checked his email. Nothing explicit, no warnings, no notices. Just a slight change in response time. Kevin leaned back, exhaling quietly. He told himself it was routine, system maintenance, increased oversight, end-of-quarter adjustments, all plausible. But the timing aligned too closely with recent activity. He opened a message thread with Michael Carter reading over their previous exchanges. The tone remained professional, controlled, within acceptable boundaries. But now, in hindsight, certain phrases carried more weight than they had before. Process this today. Keep it within standard thresholds. No delays. Kevin closed the thread. He did not delete it. He knew better than that. Crystal sat in the pediatric clinic waiting room that afternoon, one of the twins resting against her shoulder, the other sleeping in the stroller beside her. The room was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of other children, muted conversations, the steady rhythm of an environment designed for care rather than urgency. She held a small folder in her hands. Not the divorce papers, something else. Inside were printed pages, not evidence in its final form, not yet structured for legal presentation, but enough to confirm alignment between what she had observed and what now existed within the system. Jonathan had not sent them directly. He had not needed to. The delivery had been indirect, routed through appropriate channels, formatted in a way that maintained discretion. Crystal did not read them again. She had already seen enough. The details matched. Dates, times, sequences. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing missing. She closed the folder and rested it on her lap. Across from her, a mother spoke softly to her child, adjusting a blanket with gentle precision. The scene was ordinary, grounded in the kind of care that required no audience. Crystal watched for a moment, then lowered her gaze. Her world remained centered. Not on Michael, not on the bank, but on what would remain after everything else concluded. At Sterling Crest, Daniel reviewed the first compiled correlation report. It was not labeled as such. Officially, it remained part of the preservation scope. But the structure had changed. Transactions aligned with communication. Communication aligned with access logs. Internal alerts, once dismissed as isolated, now appeared in sequence. He read through the report slowly. No immediate conclusions, just observation. The transfers themselves were not illegal on their own. The amounts were within limits. The accounts were properly established. But the method, the repetition, the timing the pressure applied to accelerate processing suggested something more deliberate, something designed to avoid visibility. Daniel closed the file. "Prepare a summary," he said. "Internal use only." The assistant nodded. No distribution, not yet. There was a rhythm to these things. Act too early and you risked misinterpretation. Act too late and the structure might already have shifted. Timing, like everything else, mattered. Michael sensed none of this. From his perspective, the system remained stable. There had been minor delays, yes, but nothing outside the range of normal variance. Financial institutions moved at different speeds depending on volume oversight and internal priorities. He had accounted for that. What mattered to him was outcome. And the outcome, as far as he could see, remained intact. He met Lauren that evening at a quiet restaurant, the kind that balanced discretion with status. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere controlled. She watched him as he spoke. "So it's done?" she asked. Almost Michael replied, "The structure is in place. Final adjustments are just timing." Lauren nodded, her expression thoughtful, and Crystal Michael leaned back slightly. "She'll sign." There was no hesitation in his voice. Lauren studied him for a moment longer. "You're sure?" Michael met her gaze. "She doesn't understand this level." It was the same assumption he had made before, repeated, unchallenged. Lauren accepted it. Not because she had verified it, but because it aligned with the version of events she preferred. "Then we move forward," she said. Michael nodded. From his perspective, there was nothing left to question. Back at the apartment, Crystal placed the twins in their cribs, adjusting the room to a dim, steady light. She moved with quiet efficiency, each action deliberate, each step familiar. Once they were settled, she returned to the living area. The notebook remained where she had left it, closed, unused. She sat down and looked at it for a moment. There was a time when every entry had mattered, when each observation added to a structure she was still building. Now that structure existed elsewhere, in systems designed to preserve without bias, in records that would not change. She did not open the notebook. Instead, she reached for her phone. A message from Jonathan appeared. No details, just a single line. Initial alignment confirmed. Proceeding as planned. Crystal read it once, then set the phone down. No reply. None was needed. At Sterling Crest, the summary Daniel had requested was completed. Concise, precise. It outlined the sequence without interpretation. Dates, transactions, communications, no accusations, no conclusions, just a framework. He reviewed it carefully. Then he added one line at the end. Recommend continued observation under controlled parameters. He saved the file, did not send it, not yet. The next morning, Michael returned to the bank. Not for the divorce, for the final adjustments. He moved through the lobby with the same confidence he had carried before, acknowledging staff with brief nods, his presence unchallenged. To him, this was a continuation, a process nearing completion. He approached Kevin Adler's desk. "Everything on track?" he asked. Kevin hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes," he said. "Just minor delays." Michael frowned slightly. "Define minor." "System review," Kevin replied. "Routine." Michael studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Make sure it stays routine." Kevin held his gaze. "Of course." Michael turned and walked away. Kevin exhaled slowly. The conversation had been brief, but the pressure remained. Crystal stood by the window that afternoon, the city stretching out before her in steady lines. Nothing in the view suggested change. Everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. But she understood the difference. The process was no longer theoretical. It was active, not visible, not yet, but moving. And when it reached its conclusion, it would not require explanation, only acknowledgement, because the truth, once preserved in its entirety, did not need to be argued. It only needed to be seen. Michael Carter began to relax. Not outwardly at first. His posture remained controlled. His tone measured, his decisions deliberate. But beneath that surface, a shift had taken place. The kind that came when a person believed the most difficult part was already behind them. He no longer checked his phone with the same urgency. Notifications, when they appeared, were glanced at, not studied. The tension that had once shaped his movements had eased into something closer to routine confidence. In his mind, the transfers were nearly complete. The structure held. And most importantly, there had been no resistance. That absence became his strongest validation. He interpreted it as confirmation that he had acted correctly, that the system had functioned exactly as he expected, that whatever remained was procedural, not uncertain. He began to think ahead. Lauren Price noticed the change before he acknowledged it himself. They met more frequently now, no longer confined to discrete intervals or carefully timed appearances. Their conversations shifted from speculation to planning, from possibility to assumption. "You're different," she said one evening, watching him across the table. Michael looked up briefly. How less careful? He considered that for a moment. Because there's less to be careful about. Lauren leaned back slightly, studying him. That confident Michael met her gaze. "It's done." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Lauren accepted the answer with a small nod, her attention already moving towards what came next. "Then we should finalize the apartment," she said. "There's no reason to wait." Michael agreed. From his perspective, delay no longer served a purpose. At Sterling Crest, the absence Michael relied on had taken on a different meaning. Daniel Brooks did not escalate. He did not call for intervention, did not initiate formal proceedings, did not notify external authorities. He observed. The summary he had prepared remained internal, unshared, beyond the smallest necessary circle. The data continued to accumulate, not because it was being actively expanded, but because the system itself continued to function. New transactions appeared, not large, not irregular in isolation, but consistent with the pattern already established. Daniel reviewed them as they came in, aligning each one with the existing structure. The timeline extended. The sequence deepened. Nothing disrupted it. That in itself was significant. Kevin Adler found it increasingly difficult to ignore the shift. The delays had not disappeared. They had stabilized. Every request he submitted now followed a slightly altered path. Still processed, still completed. But with an additional layer he could not see. He adjusted his behavior accordingly. His emails became more precise. Less urgency, more formality. He avoided phrasing that might suggest pressure. Replaced it with language that implied routine. But the earlier messages remained. Unchanged. Preserved. He knew that. And knowing it altered the way he sat at his desk, the way he reviewed each transaction, the way he responded when Michael appeared. The confidence he had once mirrored was no longer available. Only caution. Crystal Hughes did not follow any of this in real time. She did not need to. The structure had already been set. The process now moved independently of her observation. She focused instead on continuity. The twins had begun to settle into a more predictable rhythm. Their sleep cycles aligned more often than not. Their responses to her presence had become immediate, instinctive. She moved through each day with the same steady attention she had maintained from the beginning, feeding, holding, watching. There was no visible trace of the larger process unfolding beyond the walls of the apartment. No urgency in her movements, no distraction in her gaze. But beneath that calm, there was clarity, not about what Michael was doing, but about where it would lead. One afternoon, while the twins slept, Crystal sat at the table with the folder Jonathan had arranged. She opened it slowly. Inside, the pages remained as she had last seen them, structured, precise, aligned. She turned to the first section, transaction summaries, dates and amounts listed without commentary, no emphasis, no interpretation, just sequence. She moved to the next, communication logs, short exchanges, controlled language, timing that matched the transactions. Then the final section, internal flags, minimal, cleared at the time, but present. Crystal closed the folder. She did not need to read further. The information had reached a point where it no longer required her analysis. It would stand on its own. Michael's next visit to the bank felt different. Not because anything had visibly changed, but because he no longer approached it with the same caution. He walked through the lobby with ease, his attention divided between his phone and the environment around him. Staff acknowledged him as they always had. Nothing in their behavior suggested awareness. He interpreted that as confirmation. At Kevin Adler's desk, the interaction was brief. "Everything aligned?" Michael asked. Kevin nodded. Yes. The answer was technically correct. The system had not rejected anything. The transactions had gone through. Alignment, however, carried more than one meaning. Michael accepted it at face value. "Good," he said. He did not ask for details. He no longer felt the need. Daniel Brooks observed the interaction from a distance, not directly, through the system. Access logs indicated Michael's presence. Kevin's terminal activity aligned with it. The timing matched. No need for physical proximity. The structure spoke clearly enough. Daniel made no note. There was no need. The pattern continued. Lauren, meanwhile, began to shift her expectations. "What about timing?" she asked during one of their meetings. "When does everything finalize?" Michael considered the question. "Soon," he said. "There are just a few things to complete." Lauren nodded, but her expression carried a subtle change. Expectation had replaced curiosity. "And Crystal?" she asked. Michael's response did not change. "She'll sign." Lauren studied him for a moment longer, then looked away. She accepted the answer, but the certainty behind it now carried weight. That evening, Crystal stood by the window once more. The city moved as it always did. Lights shifting, traffic flowing, patterns repeating. From this distance, Everything appeared stable, predictable. But she understood that stability was often a surface condition. Beneath it, structures shifted, quietly, precisely. She rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze steady. There was no anticipation in her expression, no urgency, only awareness. Because what Michael believed was nearing completion had not yet reached its conclusion. And what he understood as control had not yet been tested. The system he trusted continued to operate. The records continued to assemble. And somewhere within that structure, the difference between intention and outcome was becoming clearer with each passing day. Crystal did not need to act. Not yet. Because the truth once fully formed would not require her to present it, only to allow it to be seen. The first piece of hard evidence did not arrive as a revelation. It appeared quietly, already complete. Daniel Brooks received it as part of the continued alignment process. No alert, no escalation flag, just a set of internal communications that, when placed alongside the existing transaction timeline, no longer read as routine. He opened the file without expectation. A thread of emails between Michael Carter and Kevin Adler. Short messages, efficient, professional, but timing changed everything. The first email had been sent at 10:38 p.m. Need this processed tonight. Keep it within standard thresholds. Kevin's response followed at 10:41 p.m. Processing. Will route through Carter Holdings LLC as before. Daniel paused. He cross-referenced the time. A transaction had been initiated at 10:42 p.m. He moved to the next exchange, 2 days later. Push this through before morning. No delays. Kevin's reply, will require override on timing. Michael's response, then override it. The language was still controlled, but no longer neutral. Daniel leaned back slightly. The distinction was subtle, but critical. Instruction had replaced request. He continued reading. Another message later in the sequence. Make sure this doesn't trigger review. Kevin's reply had been slower this time. I'll keep it within limits. No confirmation, no assurance, just compliance. Daniel closed the file for a moment, then reopened it. He did not interpret. He aligned. Each message matched a transaction. Each instruction preceded movement. Each response confirmed execution. The pattern was no longer inferred. It was documented. Kevin Adler felt the shift the moment the internal request for clarification arrived. Not an accusation, not a warning, a question. Please confirm the context of recent transaction processing for Carter Holdings LLC. The message came through internal compliance channels. Neutral tone, standard format. But the timing was exact. Kevin read it twice, then once more. His hands remained still on the keyboard. He knew what it meant, not formally, not yet, but enough. He opened the email thread with Michael again. The messages now carried a different weight. Each word, once routine, now felt deliberate, exposed. He closed the thread, opened a new response. His fingers hovered for a moment before typing. All transactions were processed within established thresholds and procedures. He paused, then added, no irregularities were identified at the time of execution. He read the message once, then sent it. It was true, technically, but truth in this context was no longer defined by thresholds alone. Crystal Hughes received no direct update. She did not expect one. The process she had initiated was not designed for visibility. It was designed for accuracy. Still, she understood that a shift had occurred, not because of new information, but because of timing. The structure had reached a point where alignment would begin to produce clarity. She sat in the living room, one of the twins resting against her shoulder, the other asleep nearby. The quiet was familiar, steady. Her phone rested on the table beside her. A single message appeared. From Jonathan Reeves. Communication logs align with transaction timeline. No further detail. None was needed. Crystal read the message once, then placed the phone back down. Her expression did not change. But the confirmation settled into place. The first layer had solidified. Michael Carter noticed something different the next time he spoke to Kevin. Not in what was said, but in how it was delivered. Everything still moving. Michael asked, his tone casual. Kevin nodded. Yes. The answer came too quickly, too precise. Michael studied him for a moment. No issues. Kevin held his gaze. Nothing outside normal parameters. The phrasing was careful. Michael recognized that, but he dismissed it. Caution in his experience was often a matter of personality, not circumstance. Some people preferred exact language. Kevin was one of them. Good, Michael said. He did not press further. He had no reason to. From his perspective, the outcome remained unchanged. Daniel Brooks did not escalate the communication logs immediately. He integrated them, added them to the existing framework. Transaction, instruction, execution. The sequence now contained a voice, not audio, but intent. He opened a new file, structured, ordered. He placed the emails alongside the transaction data, aligned timestamps, noted intervals. The pattern held. He moved to the next step, request audio logs where applicable, he instructed. The assistant nodded. From internal systems, yes. Certain calls, depending on context and compliance requirements, were recorded. Not all, not automatically, but enough to provide reference when needed. The system responded. A partial set. Daniel selected the relevant entries, pressed play. Michael's voice filled the room. Clear, controlled. This needs to move tonight. A pause. I don't want any delay on this. Kevin's voice followed. It may trigger timing review. Michael again. Then keep it under. The call ended. Daniel did not react. He stopped the playback, returned to the file, added a note. No conclusion, just placement. Crystal adjusted the twins' blankets that evening, the soft light in the room casting long, quiet shadows across the floor. The day had passed without interruption. No calls, no confrontations. Nothing that suggested change. But beneath that stillness, the structure had evolved. Evidence now existed in multiple forms. Not just pattern, not just observation, but record, documented, preserved, aligned. She sat down at the table, her hands resting lightly on its surface. The notebook remained closed. Unnecessary now. The process had moved beyond it. Her role had shifted, from observer to witness. Michael, unaware of the depth forming beneath his actions, continued forward. He met Lauren again that night. Their conversation moved easily, unburdened by uncertainty. It's almost done, he said. Lauren smiled. I knew it would be. She reached for her glass, her expression relaxed. And she still hasn't signed, Michael shook his head. She will. The certainty remained, unchanged. Lauren studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then we move on. Michael agreed. From his perspective, nothing stood in the way. At Sterling Crest, Daniel reviewed the compiled file one final time before closing it. Transactions, emails, audio. Each element supported the others. No gaps, no inconsistencies. Just sequence. He did not label it as evidence. Not yet. He left it where it was. Contained, controlled, waiting. Because the moment of presentation mattered as much as the content itself. Too early, and it could be dismissed. Too late, and it might no longer be relevant. Timing, as always, was precise. Crystal stood by the window once more, the city stretching beyond her in quiet lines of light. She held no documents in her hands, no phone, no visible connection to what was unfolding elsewhere. But she understood the difference. The first layer had been established, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through alignment. The truth had begun to take shape, not as a single moment, but as a structure. And once complete, it would not require explanation, only recognition. Because what had once been hidden in fragments was now whole. And what Michael believed had been erased had in fact been preserved exactly as it had occurred. Pressure did not arrive all at once. It spread, quietly, incrementally, in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. A delay here, a request for clarification there. Nothing that on its own suggested consequence. But together, they formed a shift subtle, controlled, and increasingly difficult to ignore. Michael Carter noticed the first disruption in timing. A transfer he expected to clear within hours extended into the next day. Not rejected, not flagged, simply delayed. He checked the system again. Still pending. He exhaled slowly, then picked up his phone. "Kevin," he said when the call connected. "What's holding it?" Kevin Adler's response came with measured calm. "Internal review queue, nothing unusual." Michael frowned slightly. "It's been over 12 hours. "Yes," Kevin replied. "Volume's higher than normal." Michael said nothing for a moment. Volume was a plausible explanation, but not a satisfying one. "Push it through," he said finally. "I'll monitor it," Kevin answered. The phrasing was different. Michael noticed, but he let it pass. For now, at Sterling Crest, the delay had not been accidental. It had been introduced, not as a barrier, as a lens. Daniel Brooks had authorized a controlled slowdown on select transactions within the preserved scope. Not enough to disrupt normal operations, not enough to trigger complaint, but sufficient to allow deeper alignment before execution. It was not intervention. It was observation extended in time. Each delay created space. Space for correlation. Space for verification. Space for the structure to become undeniable. Daniel reviewed the pending transfer. It matched the established pattern. Amount within threshold. Routing consistent. Timing aligned with previous sequences. He did not approve it immediately. He allowed it to remain where it was. Visible, unresolved. Kevin felt the pressure in that pause. Not from Daniel, not directly, from the system itself. Each delay introduced a question he could not answer. Not formally, not without stepping beyond his role. He sat at his desk, watching the transaction status remain unchanged. Pending. The word carried more weight now than it ever had before. He opened the internal dashboard again, checked the queue. Nothing unusual on the surface. But beneath it, something had shifted. He could feel it, not as a directive, as an awareness. He closed the screen and waited. Crystal Hughes did not call. She did not ask for updates. But she noticed the difference. Not in data, in timing. The absence of movement where movement had been consistent. She sat in the living room, the twins resting beside her, their breathing steady, their presence grounding. Her phone lay on the table. No new messages, none were necessary. The process had reached a stage where silence itself carried information. She understood that, because she had seen it before, in different contexts, different systems. The moment when action slowed, not because it had stopped, but because it was being examined. She rested her hand lightly on the arm of the chair, still, patient, certain. Michael did not share that certainty. The second delay came sooner than expected. Another transaction, another pause. This time, he did not wait as long. He went directly to the bank. The lobby remained unchanged. The same polished surfaces, the same quiet professionalism, the same controlled environment that had always reassured him. He approached Kevin's desk without announcement. "What's happening?" he asked. Kevin looked up. "Processing," he replied. Michael's expression tightened. "That's not an answer." Kevin held his gaze. "It's accurate." Michael leaned slightly forward. "This isn't how it's been working." Kevin paused, then spoke carefully. "There's additional internal review on certain sequences." The words landed with precision, not defensive, not explanatory, just enough. Michael absorbed them. Why, Kevin's response did not change. Standard compliance protocols. Michael exhaled slowly. The phrase was familiar. Too familiar, since when he asked. Kevin did not answer immediately. "Recently," he said. Michael studied him for a moment longer, then straightened. "Make sure it stays within standard timelines." Kevin nodded. "I'll monitor it." The same phrasing, repeated. Michael turned and walked away, his steps measured, controlled. But the certainty beneath them had shifted. Slightly. Lauren noticed the change that evening. Not in what Michael said, in how he said it. "Something's off," she observed. Michael looked at her. "It's just delays." Lauren tilted her head slightly. "You didn't say that before." Michael held her gaze. "It's nothing." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Lauren watched him for a moment, then looked away. If it's nothing, she said, then it shouldn't matter. Michael nodded. Exactly. But the word did not settle. At Sterling Crest, the internal review expanded not outward, but inward. Daniel Brooks requested a deeper alignment. Not new data, a different perspective. He brought the transaction sequence into a controlled session with a small internal team. No formal designation, no external communication, just analysis. They reviewed the timeline. Transaction, email, audio, delay. Each element placed in sequence. No interpretation, only structure. One of the analysts spoke. "The pattern's consistent." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Another voice. And the intent. Daniel did not respond immediately. "Document the sequence," he said instead. Intent would be addressed later. For now, structure was enough. Kevin received a second internal message. Short, direct. "Please confirm any instances of expedited processing for Carter Holdings, LLC." He stared at the screen. Expedited. The word narrowed the focus, removed ambiguity. He opened the email thread again, read through the messages, each one now framed differently. He began typing, stopped, deleted, started again. Certain transactions were processed within requested time frames, consistent with client expectations and within operational limits. He paused, then added, "No deviations from established thresholds occurred." He sent the message. His hands remained still for a moment afterward, then moved away from the keyboard. Crystal stood by the window that night. The city moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged. But she understood the difference. The system had shifted from observation to pressure. Not visible, not declared, but present. She did not need confirmation. The pattern had reached a point where resistance was inevitable, not from her, from the structure itself. Because once a system begins to recognize inconsistency, it cannot unsee it. It adjusts, it slows, it examines. And in doing so, it reveals. Michael returned home later than usual. His movements carried a trace of something new. Not anxiety, awareness. He placed his keys on the counter, his phone beside them. Crystal sat nearby, one of the twins in her arms. She looked up briefly. "How was your day?" she asked. Michael hesitated, then answered. "Busy." The word held more than it revealed. Crystal nodded. "I imagine." She did not ask further, did not press. Her silence remained consistent. But now it carried a different weight. Not absence, presence. Michael watched her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether something had changed. She met his gaze, calm, unmoved. He looked away first. At Sterling Crest, the pending transaction finally moved. Approved, processed, completed. Daniel noted the timing, noted the delay, added it to the sequence. The pattern expanded, now including resistance, now including pressure, now including response. He closed the file, not finished, but closer, because the system had begun to act. And once it did, the outcome was no longer a matter of assumption. It was a matter of time. Crystal turned away from the window. The room remained quiet, the twins asleep, the world steady. But beneath it, everything had shifted. The structure was no longer forming. It was holding, and what held could be seen. What could be seen could be understood, and what could be understood would not require her to speak, only to stand, and let the truth move forward on its own. Michael Carter did not recognize the exact moment when control began to slip from assumption into uncertainty, because from his perspective, nothing had been taken away. The accounts still existed, the transactions still processed, and the structure he had built remained intact on the surface. Yet something beneath that surface had begun to resist him in a way that could no longer be dismissed as routine delay. It was not a disruption that announced itself clearly, but rather a gradual tightening of space, as though the system he trusted had quietly decided to observe him more closely than before. He responded in the only way he knew how, which was to reassert narrative authority. The legal angle in his mind remained the most efficient path forward, because while financial systems could introduce variables beyond his immediate reach, the structure of a divorce case allowed for framing positioning and controlled interpretation. He had already initiated that process through Richard Hale, an attorney known for precision discretion and a willingness to construct arguments that relied more on presentation than confrontation. They met in Hale's office overlooking Midtown, a space designed to reflect credibility without drawing unnecessary attention. The walls were lined with case files and legal texts, not for display, but for function. And the desk between them held a carefully arranged set of documents that suggested readiness rather than urgency. Richard Hale did not begin with questions. He began with review. "I've gone through the initial filing," he set his tone, even his attention fixed on the pages in front of him. "The structure is clean, but it assumes compliance from your wife." Michael leaned back slightly, his posture controlled but less relaxed than it had been days earlier. "She'll comply," he said. "There's no incentive for her not to." Hale lifted his eyes briefly. "Incentives are not always financial," he replied, "especially when timing becomes relevant." Michael did not respond immediately, and the silence that followed was not one of agreement, but of calculation. He had not considered timing as a factor that might work against him, because in his understanding, everything that mattered had already been moved, secured, and placed beyond challenge. "I want to proceed," Michael said, without delay. Hale nodded once, then adjusted the file slightly. "Then we strengthen the position," he said. "We establish narrative clarity early so that any later objections appear reactive rather than substantive." The phrasing aligned with Michael's thinking, and he allowed a small measure of confidence to return. "What does that look like?" he asked. Hale turned a page. "We introduce documentation that frames your wife as financially dependent, emotionally unstable post-childbirth, and unable to manage complex financial matters independently. Nothing exaggerated, nothing that can be disproven directly, but enough to create a baseline assumption." Michael considered the proposal not with hesitation, but with evaluation. It was not entirely accurate, but accuracy in this context was less important than plausibility. "She hasn't challenged anything," he said. "Which supports the narrative," Hale replied. "Silence can be interpreted in multiple ways. We decide which one the court sees first." Michael nodded slowly. And the accounts Hale did not look up this time. As long as there is no formal dispute, they remain outside immediate scrutiny. The burden of challenge would fall on her. Michael exhaled the tension in his shoulders, easing just enough to be noticeable. Then we move forward. Hale closed the file. We move carefully, he said. The distinction was subtle, but present. Michael accepted it without question. What Michael did not understand was that his attempt to control the legal narrative did not exist in isolation from the financial structure he had already set in motion. By introducing formal claims regarding Crystal's financial capability, he had inadvertently created a point of intersection between two systems that had previously remained separate. At Sterling Crest, that intersection did not go unnoticed. Daniel Brooks received notice of the legal filing not as an escalation, but as information routed through appropriate channels that ensured institutional awareness without triggering immediate action. The content itself was not unusual, but its alignment with existing observations introduced a new dimension to the review. He read through the summary once, then, again not searching for inconsistencies, but for connection, claims of financial dependence, assertions of limited awareness, implications that Crystal Hughes did not possess the capacity to understand or challenge complex transactions. Daniel did not react. He simply placed the document alongside the existing file. The alignment was immediate. Not because it contradicted anything, but because it attempted to define a reality that the data did not support. He turned to his assistant. "Add this to the internal file," he said. "Mark as contextual." The assistant nodded. No external response, not yet. Daniel's voice remained calm, but his attention had sharpened. The structure had expanded. Crystal Hughes read the legal filing in the same manner she had read everything else, without visible reaction. The document had been delivered through proper channels formatted precisely structured to guide interpretation rather than invite it. She moved through each section slowly, not because she needed time to understand it, but because she allowed herself to see the intent behind the language. Financial dependence, emotional instability, limited capacity. The words were chosen carefully. Not aggressive enough to provoke immediate rejection. Not vague enough to be meaningless, positioned exactly where they would influence perception. Crystal closed the document and placed it on the table beside her. The twins slept nearby, their presence grounding the moment in a reality that no document could redefine. She did not reach for her phone. She did not call Jonathan. There was nothing to respond to, because the filing, while intended as an attack, functioned instead as confirmation. Michael had moved, and in doing so, he had extended the structure beyond his control. Later that evening, when Michael returned home, the air between them carried a subtle difference that neither of them acknowledged directly. He placed his belongings down with the same practiced precision, but his attention lingered on Crystal longer than usual, as though he were measuring something that had not yet revealed itself. "You received the filing," he said. It was not a question. Crystal looked up. "I did." He waited, expecting something more. A reaction, a challenge, a refusal. None came. "It clarifies things," he continued. Crystal held his gaze for a moment. "It clarifies your position," she said. The distinction was quiet but absolute. Michael's expression shifted slightly, not into anger, but into something more controlled, more deliberate. "That's what matters," he replied. Crystal did not respond. She returned her attention to the twins adjusting a blanket that had shifted slightly, her movements steady, unaffected. To Michael, the moment felt incomplete. He had expected resistance, or at least acknowledgement of the weight behind what he had initiated. Instead, he was met with the same calm that had followed every step he had taken. He turned away first. At Sterling Crest, the integration of legal context with financial records continued without interruption. Daniel Brooks did not accelerate the process, nor did he delay it. He allowed it to unfold at the pace required to maintain accuracy, because at this stage, speed no longer served a purpose. The structure was already holding. Each new element did not change it, it strengthened it. And as it strengthened, the need for interpretation diminished. What remained was sequence. Clear, aligned, undeniable. Crystal stood by the window that night, the city lights reflecting across the glass in steady, unbroken lines. She held no documents in her hands, no visible connection to the processes unfolding beyond the apartment, yet she understood the exact position she now occupied. Not as someone responding, not as someone defending, but as someone who had allowed the structure to complete itself. Michael believed he had advanced the situation by formalizing his claims, by defining her in terms that suited his outcome, by placing his narrative into a system that would validate it. What he had done instead was provide the final alignment needed for everything beneath it to rise into view. Crystal did not need to challenge him. She did not need to correct the record, because the record already preserved, already structured, would do that on its own. And when it did, it would not be her voice that shifted the outcome. It would be the truth presented exactly as it had always been. The legal process did not accelerate in the way Michael Carter expected. It did not surge forward with decisive motions or immediate rulings, nor did it stall in a way that would have alerted him to danger. Instead, it entered a phase that appeared procedural on the surface, yet beneath that surface it deepened in scope and consequence with each passing day. From Michael's perspective, this phase was manageable. It involved filings, responses, scheduled communications between counsel, and the gradual construction of a case narrative that he believed had already been secured. He relied on Richard Hale to guide that process, trusting that the structure they had established would hold under scrutiny because it had been designed to appear coherent and controlled. What he did not recognize was that the legal system, much like the financial one he had attempted to navigate, did not operate solely on presentation. It operated on record, and the record now had begun to organize itself. Jonathan Reeves initiated the next step without urgency but with precision. He did not challenge the filing directly, nor did he attempt to dismantle Michael's narrative through immediate rebuttal. Instead, he introduced a formal request for financial disclosure structured in a way that aligned with standard legal procedure, while extending its reach just far enough to intersect with the preserved data at Sterling Crest. The request itself was unremarkable in form. Disclosure of accounts, transaction histories, associated entities. Nothing beyond what the court would expect, but timing once again transformed its significance. Because now the request did not exist in isolation. It aligned with a system that had already preserved, correlated, and structured the very information being asked for. Jonathan understood that alignment. He had not rushed toward it. He had waited until it was unavoidable. At Sterling Crest, Daniel Brooks received notice of the disclosure request through internal channels that maintained both legal compliance and institutional discretion. The request did not surprise him. In fact, it confirmed the trajectory he had already anticipated. He reviewed the scope carefully. The accounts listed matched the preserved set. The entities aligned with Carter Holdings LLC and its associated structures. The timeline overlapped precisely with the period already under observation. There was no expansion required, only release. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering the implications. "Prepare the disclosure package," he said. The assistant hesitated. Full release. Daniel's response was measured, within legal parameters, complete and unaltered. There was no need to interpret, no need to frame. The data as it existed was sufficient. Kevin Adler received internal notice shortly after. A formal instruction to cooperate with disclosure procedures related to specific accounts. The language was neutral, expected, but the weight behind it had changed. He read the notice once, then again, his eyes moving more slowly the second time. Cooperation, documentation, verification. Words that until now had existed as background elements of his role had moved to the forefront. He opened his email archive. The messages were still there, unchanged, preserved exactly as they had been sent. He did not attempt to alter them. He knew that was no longer possible. Instead, he began organizing. Not to conceal, but to prepare. Michael learned of the disclosure request through Richard Hale. They met again in the same office, the same controlled environment, but the tone had shifted slightly, not in volume, but in density. "There's a disclosure request," Hale said, placing the document on the desk between them. Michael glanced at it, his expression unchanged. "That's standard." "Yes," Hale replied. "But timing matters." Michael looked up. "What's that supposed to mean?" Hale leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "It means the request aligns closely with your recent financial activity." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That doesn't change anything he said. Everything was handled properly. Hale did not challenge the statement directly. "I'm not suggesting otherwise," he said. "I'm suggesting that we need to ensure consistency between what has been filed and what will be disclosed." Michael held his gaze. "There is consistency," Hale nodded once. "Then the process will reflect that." The words were neutral, but their implication was not. Crystal Hughes received the disclosure notice later that same day. She read it in the same manner she had approached every document before it, with quiet attention and without visible reaction. The language was familiar, structured to facilitate transparency, to allow the court to see what had previously remained within private systems. She closed the document and set it aside. There was no need to respond immediately, because for the first time, the legal process had reached a point where it would intersect directly with the preserved record. And at that intersection, interpretation would no longer hold the same weight. At Sterling Crest, the disclosure package began to assemble. Transaction histories were compiled in chronological order. Communication logs were attached where relevant. Authorization records were included to demonstrate sequence and responsibility. Nothing was removed. Nothing was added. The structure remained exactly as it had been observed. Daniel reviewed the package once then, again not searching for errors, but ensuring that alignment had been preserved through every layer. It had. He authorized the release. Michael did not feel the shift immediately. From his perspective, the process remained controlled, moving through expected channels guided by legal structure and professional oversight. The request for disclosure did not in itself indicate risk. It was a step he had anticipated, one that he believed would reinforce his position rather than undermine it. He returned home that evening with the same measured composure, placing his phone and keys on the counter before glancing toward Crystal. "They're requesting financial records," he said. It was not a warning. It was a statement. Crystal looked up. "I know." Her tone remained calm. Michael studied her for a moment. "It doesn't change anything," he added. Crystal held his gaze briefly. "We'll see," she said. The words were simple, but their placement carried weight. Later that night, as the apartment settled into its usual quiet, Crystal stood near the window, the city lights stretching beyond her in steady patterns that mirrored the structure unfolding elsewhere. She did not think about Michael's words. She did not consider the outcome as something to anticipate, because what mattered now was not what either of them believed. It was what had already been recorded. The disclosure would not create new information. It would reveal what already existed. And once revealed, it would not require explanation, only acknowledgement. At Sterling Crest, the package left the system without fanfare. No announcement, no escalation. Just a transfer of information from one structured environment to another. Daniel Brooks closed the file, not because it was complete, but because it had reached its next stage. The process no longer belonged solely to the bank. It had entered the legal domain. Where record once introduced could not be withdrawn. Michael, still operating within his assumption of control, did not yet understand the significance of that transition. He believed the system remained fragmented, separate, manageable. What he had not accounted for was convergence. The moment when separate structures aligned, when financial record met legal requirement, when preserved data entered formal review, and when at last the truth no longer existed in parts. But as a whole, the room did not announce its change. It revealed it. Gradually, through tone, through posture, through the narrowing of space between what was expected and what was actually present. By the time Michael Carter understood that something had shifted, the shift had already completed itself. The meeting was scheduled as a procedural alignment. That was how Richard Hale described it. A controlled environment, a necessary step before formal proceedings advanced further. Representatives from Sterling Crest would be present to confirm disclosure integrity, along with legal counsel on both sides. No audience, no unnecessary attention, just structure. Michael accepted that framing without hesitation. He entered the building with the same measured confidence he had carried into every previous interaction. His posture steady, his expression composed. From his perspective, this was a continuation of a process already under control. A final verification before the outcome he had anticipated became official. Crystal Hughes arrived shortly after. She did not enter with visible authority, nor did she carry any outward indication of the position she held within the institution hosting the meeting. Her presence was quiet, aligned with everything she had maintained from the beginning. She moved through the corridor without pause, her attention steady, her posture unchanged. The twins were not with her. For the first time since the process began, she stood alone. Inside the conference room, the environment reflected the same precision that defined the bank itself. Glass walls, muted lighting, a long table positioned at the center. Documents arranged in ordered stacks. Screens positioned but inactive. Daniel Brooks was already seated. He did not stand when Michael entered. He acknowledged him with a brief nod, nothing more. Michael noticed, but he did not assign meaning to it. Not yet. Richard Hale took his place beside Michael. His demeanor unchanged, his focus directed toward the materials in front of him. Across the table, Jonathan Reeves sat quietly, his presence unobtrusive but unmistakably anchored. Crystal took a seat beside him. No introduction was made, none was necessary. The room settled into stillness. Then the process began. Daniel Brooks initiated the session with a tone that remained consistent throughout. Measured, precise. We are here to confirm the alignment between disclosed financial records and internal transaction history, he said. No emphasis, no interpretation, just purpose. Michael leaned back slightly. His posture relaxed, his attention fixed on the documents before him. From his perspective, this was validation, a procedural confirmation of what he had already established. Daniel continued. The records provided include transaction sequences, associated communications, and authorization logs relevant to the accounts in question. Michael nodded once. Understood, he said. Daniel acknowledged the response, then turned to the first document. A summary. Dates aligned in a vertical column. Transactions listed without commentary. Amounts, times, destinations. Michael glanced at it briefly. Nothing unexpected. He had seen these numbers before, or believed he had. Daniel moved to the next section. Corresponding communication logs have been included for contextual alignment. The screen activated. Emails appeared. Short messages, familiar language. Michael's expression did not change immediately, but his attention sharpened. He recognized the phrasing, "Need this process tonight. Keep it within standard thresholds, then override it." The words appeared exactly as they had been sent. unaltered, unframed. Placed beside the transactions, they proceeded. Michael shifted slightly in his seat. Not discomfort, adjustment. Richard Hale leaned forward, his focus narrowing. Context matters, he said. Daniel acknowledged him with a slight nod. Agreed, he replied. Which is why alignment has been maintained. He advanced the sequence, audio. The room remained silent as Michael's own voice filled the space. Clear, controlled. This needs to move tonight. I don't want any delay on this. The playback ended. Daniel did not comment. He allowed the silence to hold. Something in the room changed then. Not visibly, but structurally. The balance Michael had assumed was no longer present. The documents did not accuse, they did not interpret. They simply existed, aligned, complete. Michael's gaze moved from the screen to the table, then briefly to Hale. For the first time, there was a pause in his certainty. What exactly is being implied here? He asked. His tone remained controlled, but the question itself marked a shift. Daniel responded without hesitation. Nothing is being implied, he said. The records are being presented. The distinction settled into the space between them. Hale spoke again. These communications reflect standard client interaction. There is no indication of misconduct. Daniel did not challenge the statement directly. He turned to the next document. Internal alerts were triggered on 2 occasions, he said. The screen updated, flags, previously cleared, now visible within the sequence. Each was reviewed and cleared at the time Daniel continued. However, in alignment with the full transaction sequence, they have been included for completeness. Michael leaned forward slightly. Cleared, he repeated. Yes, Daniel said. No emphasis, no contradiction, just confirmation. Crystal had not spoken. She had not needed to. Her presence remained constant, unchanged, from the moment she entered the room. She did not look at Michael when the emails appeared. She did not react when his voice filled the space. She observed, not the content, the structure, the way each element connected without force, the way the system itself revealed what had once been fragmented. Jonathan Reeves remained equally still beside her. No intervention, no redirection. The process did not require it. Michael's attention returned to the documents. For the first time, he did not recognize them as something he controlled. They were no longer part of a system he had navigated. They had become part of a system that now examined him. This doesn't change the overall structure, he said. The words came measured, deliberate, as if stating them would restore alignment. Hale did not immediately respond. Daniel did. The structure is reflected in the records, he said. Again, no interpretation, just placement. Michael's gaze shifted again, this time toward Crystal. She met it, calm, unmoved. There was no challenge in her expression, no accusation, only presence. For a moment the room narrowed, not physically, but in perception. Everything Michael had assumed to be separate: financial movement, legal narrative, personal control, now existed within the same space. Aligned, visible, connected. He looked away first. Daniel closed the final document. The presented materials confirm alignment between disclosed records and internal data, he said. No conclusion, no judgment, just completion. Hale straightened slightly. We will review and respond accordingly, he said. Daniel nodded. Of course. The meeting did not end with declaration. It concluded with understanding. Unspoken, but complete. As the room began to shift back into motion chairs, adjusting documents, closing, Michael remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Not because he was uncertain, but because something he had relied on no longer held. He stood, gathered his materials, and moved toward the door without looking back. Crystal remained where she was, not lingering, not delaying, just present, until the moment passed. Then she stood as well. No words exchanged, none required, because what had occurred in that room was not an argument. It was not a confrontation. It was a transition, from assumption to record, from control to visibility. And once that transition had taken place, there was no returning to what had been believed before. The reveal did not arrive as a declaration. It emerged as a correction. Not loud, not abrupt, but precise enough to realign everything that had come before it. By the time Michael Carter understood what had been revealed, the revelation itself had already settled into place, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The follow-up session was not described as a continuation. It was positioned as clarification. Richard Hale had requested it, formally, carefully, because what had been presented in the previous meeting did not on its own establish fault. But it introduced a structure that required context. Without that context, the records remained open to interpretation, and interpretation, when left unchallenged, could shift outcomes in unpredictable ways. Michael agreed. Not because he felt uncertain, but because he believed clarification would restore control. The room was the same, the table unchanged, the documents arranged with identical precision. But the atmosphere had altered. Not visibly, structurally. Michael entered with a measured pace. His posture maintained his expression composed, but beneath that composure, there was now a layer of calculation that had not been present before. He no longer assumed the outcome. He assessed it. Crystal Hughes was already seated. Her presence, as always, did not draw attention to itself yet. It defined the space more than any document or display. She sat with the same quiet steadiness, her posture unchanged, her attention directed forward rather than toward any individual. Jonathan Reeves sat beside her. Daniel Brooks remained at the head of the table. Richard Hale took his place next to Michael. No introductions, no formalities. The process resumed as though it had never paused. Hale began. "We've reviewed the materials presented," he said, his tone even controlled, designed to guide, without appearing to do so. "While the alignment between transactions and communications is noted, there remains no direct indication of misconduct. Context is essential." Daniel Brooks acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. "Context has been preserved," he replied. The phrasing carried no resistance, only readiness. Hale continued. "Our position is that all actions taken by Mr. Carter were within acceptable financial and operational parameters. Any interpretation beyond that would require a broader understanding of the institutional framework involved." The words were deliberate. They introduced a requirement, a need for something beyond the data itself. Michael listened closely. This was the space where narrative could still operate, where interpretation could still shape outcome. Daniel turned to Jonathan Reeves. A subtle shift, not an invitation, a recognition. Jonathan did not move immediately. He allowed the silence to settle, not as hesitation, but as timing. When he spoke, his voice carried no emphasis, no attempt to dominate the room, only clarity. "The institutional framework is already established," he said. Hale's attention sharpened. "In what capacity?" he asked. Jonathan folded his hands lightly on the table. "In the capacity that governs both the records and their preservation." Michael's gaze shifted. Not fully, just enough. Daniel did not interrupt. He allowed the exchange to continue. Hale leaned slightly forward. "Clarify that," he said. Jonathan's response did not change in tone. "Sterling Crest Bank operates under a trust structure," he said. "That structure includes controlling interest held through the Hughes Family Trust." The words entered the room without force, but they did not dissipate. Michael's posture remained still, but something beneath it tightened. Hale's expression did not change. But his focus narrowed. "And your relevance to that structure?" he asked. Jonathan turned his attention slightly. Not toward Michael, toward Crystal. "She is the controlling beneficiary," he said. The statement did not rise. It settled, complete. For a moment nothing moved. Not physically. But within the room the structure shifted. Michael did not react immediately, because reaction required processing. And what had just been introduced did not align with the framework he had been operating within. "The controlling beneficiary," Hale repeated. Jonathan nodded. Yes. Hale's gaze moved for the first time directly to Crystal. And that grants what level of authority Crystal met his gaze. Her expression remained calm. "Final oversight on governance decisions," she said, "including compliance structures." Her voice was steady, unforced, not declarative, simply accurate. Michael's eyes moved to her. Fully now. For the first time since the process began, his attention was not divided, not calculated, focused. "You're saying you own the bank," he said. The words were not raised, but they carried weight. Crystal held his gaze. "I'm saying the institution you used operates within a structure I oversee," she replied. The distinction was precise, not exaggerated, but complete. Michael leaned back slightly, not in relaxation, in recalibration. Everything he had assumed about separation between his actions and her awareness between the institution and her position between movement and oversight began to collapse into a single point. The transactions, the delays, the preservation, the alignment. None of it had been external. None of it had been neutral. Hale spoke again, but his tone had shifted. Subtly. "Ownership does not imply interference," he said. Jonathan acknowledged the statement. "Correct," he replied. And none occurred. Daniel Brooks added without emphasis, "All procedures were followed within established protocols." The words reinforced the structure, not challenged it. Michael's attention returned to the table. The documents, the emails, the audio, now reframed. Not as isolated actions within a neutral system, but as actions taken within a structure that had been observing him from the beginning. Not reacting, observing. The realization did not come as shock. It came as alignment. Everything that had seemed delayed, everything that had appeared procedural, everything that had remained silent, now carried context. Crystal did not move. She did not speak again. She did not need to, because the reveal had not been about power. It had been about position. And once position was understood, everything else followed. Hale closed the file in front of him, not abruptly, carefully. "We will need to reassess," he said. The words were controlled, measured, but they acknowledged what had shifted. Jonathan nodded once. "Of course." Daniel remained still. The process had reached a new phase, not escalation, recognition. Michael stood, not because the meeting had ended, but because remaining seated no longer aligned with his position. He gathered his materials slowly, deliberately, as though the act itself could restore structure. It did not. He looked at Crystal again. Not with accusation, not with anger, but with something closer to understanding. Incomplete, but forming. She met his gaze, unchanged. The same calm, the same steadiness, the same silence that had carried through every step. But now, that silence no longer suggested absence. It defined the entire structure. The room did not close the moment. It released it, without declaration, without resolution. Because what had been revealed did not end the process. It redirected it. And from that point forward, nothing Michael had assumed remained intact. Not the separation, not the control, not the narrative, only the record. and the structure that had preserved it. After the reveal, the process did not erupt into confrontation, nor did it collapse into silence. It settled into a different kind of order, one that no longer depended on assumption or positioning, but on sequence. What had previously been interpreted as strategy now existed as record, and what had once relied on narrative now stood within a structure that did not require it. Michael Carter felt the shift most clearly not in what was said to him, but in what was no longer available to him. There was no space left to shape the interpretation. There was only the structure that had already formed. The formal presentation of evidence did not take place in a courtroom. It unfolded within the same institutional environment that had preserved it under conditions that ensured accuracy without spectacle. The objective was not to argue, but to establish, and once established, to allow the legal framework to proceed without distortion. Daniel Brooks initiated the session with the same measured tone he had maintained throughout the process, his voice carrying neither authority nor hesitation, only clarity. "The sequence will be presented in full," he said. "No interpretation will be applied." The distinction mattered, because interpretation once removed left only alignment. Michael sat across the table, his posture controlled, his expression neutral, but the stillness he held now was not the same as before. It was not rooted in certainty. It was maintained through discipline. Richard Hale remained beside him, attentive, focused, but no longer directing the process. Across the table, Crystal Hughes sat in the same position she had held. From the beginning, her presence unchanged, her attention steady, her silence intact. Jonathan Reeves observed without interruption. The structure did not require intervention. The first layer was presented. Transactions, chronological, unbroken. Each movement placed in sequence, each amount aligned with its corresponding timestamp. Each destination accounted for within the structure Michael had created. There was nothing unusual in isolation. But isolation no longer existed. Daniel moved to the next layer. Communications. Emails displayed without commentary. Short instructions. Controlled language. Process tonight. Keep it within standard thresholds. Override if necessary. Each message appeared alongside the transaction it preceded. Not interpreted, placed. Michael watched the screen, his gaze steady, his breathing controlled. He did not interrupt. There was no interruption available. The third layer followed. Audio. The recordings played without introduction, without emphasis, allowing the words themselves to occupy the space. "This needs to move tonight. I don't want any delay. Keep it under review limits." The voice was unmistakable, not distorted, not framed, presented exactly as it had been recorded. When the playback ended, the room returned to silence. Not empty, defined, Daniel continued. "Internal alerts were triggered on 2 occasions," he said. The screen updated. Flags, previously cleared, now contextualized. Each alert aligned with a cluster of transactions, each cluster aligned with corresponding communications. Each communication aligned with timing that suggested intent without requiring it to be stated. The sequence held. Complete. Michael's attention shifted. Not away, deeper. Because what had been presented no longer allowed for selective focus. Every element reinforced the others. Every layer supported the same structure. He spoke then not to challenge, but to locate. These were within operational limits, he said. The statement was precise, accurate. Daniel acknowledged it. "Yes," he replied. "No contradiction, no reinforcement. Just confirmation," Michael continued. There was no breach of protocol. Daniel's response remained unchanged. All actions occurred within system parameters. The agreement did not restore control. It removed the need for argument. Because the question was no longer whether protocol had been followed. It was how it had been used. Crystal remained still. Her attention was not fixed on the screen nor on Michael, but on the structure itself as it unfolded. She did not need to verify the content. She had already seen it. What mattered now was not the information, but its placement. Each piece aligned without force. Each connection existed without explanation. This was not exposure. It was completion. Jonathan Reeves spoke for the first time since the presentation began. The sequence demonstrates coordinated activity, he said. The phrasing was measured, not accusatory, not definitive, but sufficient. Richard Hale responded, "Coordination does not imply misconduct," he said. Jonathan nodded, agreed. The agreement held, but it did not alter the structure. Daniel moved to the final layer. Authorization logs, access points, system entries confirming who initiated, who approved, who processed. Each name appeared, each action recorded. No gaps, no ambiguity. Michael's involvement was not isolated, but it was central. The structure did not assign responsibility. It displayed it. When the final document was presented, Daniel closed the file without comment. The sequence had been completed. No conclusion was offered. None was necessary. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried weight. Not emotional weight, structural weight, because everything that needed to be seen had been placed in view. Michael remained seated for a moment longer than required, not because he was uncertain, but because the position he had occupied no longer existed in the same form. There was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reframe, only the record. He stood, gathered his materials. The movement was controlled, deliberate, but it no longer carried the same certainty it once had. Richard Hale closed his file more slowly. "We will respond through formal channels," he said. Daniel nodded. Of course. The exchange was procedural, expected, but it marked a transition from presentation to consequence. Crystal did not move immediately. She allowed the moment to settle fully, not as an ending, but as a shift. What had once been fragmented was now complete. What had once required observation now required nothing. The structure stood on its own. She rose, her movements unchanged, calm, measured. She did not look at Michael, not because she avoided him, but because there was nothing left to observe. As she moved toward the door, the room returned to motion. Chairs adjusted, documents gathered, screens dimmed. The environment resumed its controlled rhythm. But the structure that had formed within it remained. Unchanged, Michael exited last, not by intention, by sequence. As he stepped into the corridor, the distance between what he had believed and what had been established became fully defined. Not as loss, not as defeat, but as alignment. Because the system he had used had not resisted him. It had recorded him. And now that record had been placed where it could no longer be separated from consequence. Crystal stepped outside into the quiet of the afternoon. The city moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged. She paused for a moment, not to reflect, but to recognize the transition. The process had moved beyond her. It no longer required her presence, only her position. And that position remained exactly as it had been from the beginning. Unmoved, unspoken, but fully understood. The resolution did not arrive with a verdict spoken aloud in a crowded courtroom, nor with a moment designed to be remembered. It emerged through documents, through signatures, through the quiet finality of a process that had already determined its direction long before it reached its conclusion. By the time the legal outcomes were formalized, there was nothing left to argue, only to accept. The divorce settlement was structured with precision, not as a reaction to what had been revealed, but as a continuation of it. Financial allocations were adjusted in accordance with verified records, not assumptions. Accounts that had once been presented as resolved were re-evaluated within the framework of disclosed transactions, ensuring that what remained was not interpretation, but alignment. Michael Carter sat across from Richard Hale as the final documents were reviewed. His posture remained controlled, his expression composed, but the certainty that had once defined his presence had been replaced by something quieter. Not resignation, not defeat, but recognition. He read each section carefully, not because he expected to find error, but because he understood now that every detail mattered in a way he had not previously considered. "This reflects the findings," Hale said. Michael nodded once. There was nothing to challenge. Because the findings had not been constructed for argument, they had been preserved. Custody was addressed with the same clarity. The twins would remain with Crystal Hughes. Primary guardianship was not assigned as a concession nor as a negotiation, but as a continuation of what had already been established in practice. Stability, consistency, and demonstrated care formed the basis of the decision, and those elements required no reinforcement. Michael was granted structured visitation. Defined, limited, not punitive, just precise. He reviewed the terms without comment. There was no space within them for reinterpretation. Lauren Price was not present. She had withdrawn from the situation before the final stages began her absence. Neither acknowledged nor discussed within the formal process. Her presence had always existed at the edge of the structure Michael built, and once that structure shifted, she had moved with it. No statement was made. None was needed. Crystal Hughes signed last. Not because she required time, but because she allowed the process to complete itself before she placed her name within it. She reviewed the final document once more. Her attention steady, her movements unchanged from the first time she had been presented with a set of papers across a polished table. There was no resemblance between the two moments. The first had been built on assumption. This one was built on record. She signed, placed the pen down, and that was all. There was no exchange between her and Michael. No final conversation. No attempt to reconcile what had happened. Because nothing within the process required it. Their positions had been defined, not through words, through structure. Michael stood as the meeting concluded, gathering the documents that now represented an outcome he had once believed he controlled. His movements remained measured, deliberate. But the absence of resistance within him was no longer an advantage. It was acknowledgement. He looked toward Crystal once, not expecting a response, not offering one. She did not look away. Her expression remained the same, calm, unmoved. Not because she had won, but because she had never engaged in the same contest. Outside, the day carried on without distinction. The city moved in its usual patterns, indifferent to the resolution that had taken place within the structured quiet of legal rooms and institutional processes. Crystal stepped into that movement without hesitation. The twins were waiting, not as symbols, not as extensions of what had happened, but as themselves. She returned to them with the same steadiness she had maintained from the beginning. Her attention centered not on what had ended, but on what continued. The apartment no longer held the same tension it once had, not because it had changed, but because the uncertainty within it had been removed. Crystal moved through the space with quiet familiarity, adjusting small details, restoring balance without urgency. The twins responded to her presence immediately, their rhythms aligning with hers in ways that required no effort. There was no visible trace of the process that had unfolded beyond those walls, no documents left open, no reminders placed in view, only continuity. Michael, in a different part of the city, occupied a space that reflected a different kind of quiet. Not unstable, not uncertain, but altered. The plans he had made, the assumptions he had built upon, no longer aligned with the reality he now inhabited. The structure he had trusted had not collapsed. It had revealed itself. And within that revelation, his position had been redefined. He did not resist it. There was no resistance available, only adjustment. At Sterling Crest Bank, The internal files related to the case were closed, not erased, not hidden, archived. The records remained exactly as they had been preserved, their structure intact, their sequence unaltered. Daniel Brooks reviewed the final documentation one last time before authorizing its closure within the system. There was no conclusion written, no summary attached, because the record itself was complete. It did not require interpretation, only retention. Jonathan Reeves received confirmation shortly after. He read it without reaction, closed the message, and continued with his work. The process for him had followed its intended course. No deviation, no escalation beyond what was required. Only alignment. Crystal stood by the window that evening, the city lights stretching out before her in steady lines that had not changed, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened did not alter the world around it. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, not in reflection, not in contemplation, but in presence. There was no sense of conclusion in her posture, no visible relief, no indication that something had been won or lost, because the process she had allowed to unfold had never been about victory. It had been about truth. And truth, once fully revealed, did not demand recognition. It existed. She turned away from the window and moved back into the room. The twins slept quietly, their breathing steady, their presence grounding everything else. She adjusted a blanket, checked the room, and sat down. The stillness that followed was not empty. It was complete. Not because nothing remained, but because what remained was clear. And clarity did not require noise. There was no final statement, no closing words spoken into the space that had once held tension. Only the continuation of a life that had never paused, even as everything around it shifted. Crystal did not look back, not because she refused to, but because there was nothing behind her that required attention. The structure had completed itself. The truth had aligned. And what remained was not defined by what had happened, but by what endured. In the end, some stories do not resolve through confrontation or triumph, but through quiet alignment. What appears to be control can dissolve the moment it is tested by truth, and what seems like silence can carry a strength that no argument can match. Crystal never needed to raise her voice because the system she trusted was built to remember to preserve and to reveal when the time was right. Perhaps that is the deeper question this story leaves behind. Not who was right or who lost, but what remains when everything unnecessary falls away. What kind of life is built not on assumption but on clarity? What kind of strength does not announce itself, but simply endures? If this story resonated with you, it might take a moment to reflect on where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. Stories like this travel quietly, but they connect people across distance in unexpected ways. And if you would like to continue exploring stories shaped by truth, resilience, and quiet strength, you are always welcome to stay, to listen, and to return.